Let me start with something that sounds almost insulting in its simplicity. Your life does not change because you dream bigger. Talk louder or hustle harder. It changes when you cross certain practical thresholds. And one of the first meaningful thresholds for most people is around $20,000. Before $20,000, most people believe their biggest problem is income. That's rarely true. The real problem is what constant financial pressure does to the human mind. When money is scarce, your brain shifts into survival mode, and survival mode is not designed for intelligent, long-term decision-making. It is designed to escape immediate pain. That difference quietly explains why so many capable people stay stuck for years. Under financial stress, every decision carries emotional weight. You don't evaluate choices based on quality or future consequences. You evaluate them based on urgency. The question is no longer, is this the right move? But will this get me through the next month? That single shift lowers standards across the board. You accept work you shouldn't. You tolerate behavior you'd otherwise avoid. You rush into commitments without thinking through second-order effects. Intelligence doesn't disappear. It simply gets overruled by fear. Here's an uncomfortable truth most people don't want to hear. Scarcity taxes rationality. It narrows perspective. It makes you impatient, reactive, and overly confident in short-term solutions. That's why quick money looks attractive when you're under pressure, even when you know better. It's also why people repeat mistakes they swore they'd never make. Fear is persuasive, and it speaks loudly when resources are thin. When you approach the $20,000 mark, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. The panic starts to fade. Not completely, but enough to create space between stimulus and response. That space is everything. It's the difference between reacting and choosing. For the first time, you can pause before deciding. You can walk away from a bad deal. You can think in probabilities instead of hopes. That small shift changes outcomes far more than people realize. With reduced pressure, decision quality improves almost automatically. You stop chasing every opportunity and start filtering them. You begin to recognize that avoiding obvious mistakes is more valuable than making occasional brilliant moves. You're no longer forced to say yes to everything, and that ability to say no is an early form of power. Quiet power, but real power. Most importantly, you regain control of your internal state. Calm returns. And calm is an unfair advantage. A calm person sees risks more clearly, waits longer, and resists the temptation to act just to feel progress. While others are busy moving fast in the wrong direction, you begin positioning yourself correctly. That's why the first real transformation isn't financial, it's cognitive. Once fear loosens its grip, rational thought comes back online. And when rationality becomes your default, the trajectory of your life starts to bend upward, often without dramatic moves, but with steady, compounding improvement that looks obvious only in hindsight. When people hear the phrase margin of safety, they usually think it belongs in textbooks or investment reports. In reality, it's one of the most practical ideas you'll ever apply to your life. Around 20 dollars in, you experience your first real margin of safety, and its impact has very little to do with luxury and everything to do with stability. It doesn't elevate your lifestyle, it stabilizes your decisions. Before this point, every setback feels catastrophic. A delayed paycheck, an unexpected expense, or a bad month can push you into chaos. That fragility forces you to operate defensively. You play not to lose, not to win. You avoid thoughtful risks and instead take reckless ones out of necessity. It's a strange paradox, but it's true. When you have no cushion, you behave in ways that create more danger. A margin of safety changes that equation. With even a modest financial buffer, mistakes become survivable. You're no longer one error away from collapse. That alone reduces stress levels in a way most people underestimate. Stress distorts judgment. Lower it, and clarity returns almost by default. You begin evaluating situations based on probability and consequence, not panic and hope. This is where dignity quietly enters the picture. Dignity isn't about status or appearances. It's about choice. When you have a buffer, you don't need to tolerate bad terms, dishonest people, or obviously unfair situations. You can walk away without drama. You can wait. And the ability to wait is one of the most underrated advantages in both life and business. At this level, patience stops being a motivational slogan and becomes a practical tool. You no longer feel pressured to force outcomes. You let things develop. You allow better opportunities to surface while others rush into the first available option just to relieve discomfort. Over time, this selective behavior produces better results with less effort. Another subtle shift occurs. You stop confusing activity with progress. With a margin of safety, there's no need to constantly prove movement. You become comfortable doing nothing when nothing intelligent presents itself. That restraint protects you from unnecessary losses, which in the real world is often more important than chasing gains. What makes this stage powerful is that it compounds quietly. Each avoided mistake preserves capital, confidence, and focus. Each patient decision reinforces the belief that restraint works. You begin trusting process over impulse. And once that trust forms, your decisions become consistently better, not because you're smarter, because you're operating from a position of stability rather than fear. That's why 20,000 matters. Not as a finish line, but as the first point where life stops feeling fragile and starts feeling manageable. From there, progress becomes less dramatic, but far more reliable, built on calm judgment and protected by a margin that keeps small errors from becoming permanent damage. Before this stage, most financial decisions are driven by urgency. You're not choosing paths, you're grabbing lifelines. Speed feels like progress because standing still feels dangerous. In that environment, fast money becomes seductive because it's smart, but because it promises relief. The problem is that relief and strategy are not the same thing, and confusing the two can cost years of your life. As you move past the 20,000 threshold, the internal dialogue begins to change. The question shifts from, how quickly can I get paid? To, What decision still makes sense 5 years from now? That shift is not motivational. It's structural. It changes how you evaluate opportunities, relationships, and even yourself. You start measuring outcomes over time instead of moments, and that alone disqualifies most distractions. This is where the difference between gamblers and builders becomes obvious. Gamblers focus on outcomes they can brag about quickly. Builders focus on systems that quietly improve their position year after year. Strategy replaces urgency because urgency is no longer controlling the timetable. You realize that moving slower in the right direction beats moving fast in the wrong one every single time. With this shift, risk is redefined. Risk is no longer about volatility or fear. It's about permanence. You start avoiding decisions that can cause irreversible damage, even if they offer short-term upside. Temporary discomfort becomes acceptable. Permanent loss does not. That mindset alone filters out a remarkable amount of stupidity. Another change occurs in how you allocate attention. Instead of chasing multiple directions at once, you narrow your focus. You understand that dilution is a form of self-sabotage. Fewer priorities, executed well, outperform scattered effort almost universally. Strategy demands subtraction, not addition, and this is where many people struggle because it requires saying no to good things in order to protect great ones. You also stop outsourcing your thinking. Trends lose their power over you. Advice becomes input, not instruction. You begin evaluating ideas through first principles instead of popularity. When something doesn't align with long-term logic, you discard it without emotional attachment. That independence is rare and it's valuable. Perhaps the most important change is how you perceive time. Time stops being the enemy and becomes the asset. You allow compounding to work rather than trying to replace it with force. You stop rushing outcomes and start positioning yourself so that progress becomes inevitable, even if it's slow. Once strategy replaces survival, consistency follows naturally. Decisions become calmer, fewer, and better. And while the outside world may not notice anything dramatic, internally the game has completely changed. This is the stage where many people quietly sabotage themselves, not through ignorance, but through misinterpretation. After reaching a financial milestone, like a 20,000, there's a powerful emotional release. Pressure eases, tension drops, and that relief feels so good that it gets mistaken for achievement. That misunderstanding is expensive. Relief is temporary, progress is structural. Confusing, the two resets people back to where they started, only now with better excuses. When the pressure lifts, the impulse to reward oneself becomes intense. New habits appear almost overnight, upgraded, spending, looser discipline, and a subtle belief that the hard part is over. The problem isn't the purchase itself, it's the message it sends to the mind. Spending too early teaches the brain that effort exists to fund comfort, not to build leverage. Once that belief settles in, momentum dies. Lifestyle inflation is dangerous precisely because it feels justified. You can afford it. Nothing breaks immediately. There's no dramatic collapse, just a slow erosion of flexibility. Monthly obligations rise quietly, while optionality disappears. And optionality, not income, is what creates freedom. When fixed costs expand, choices shrink. You become trapped not by lack of money, but by commitments you didn't need to make. Another subtle danger is identity shift. Instead of seeing yourself as someone building a foundation, you start seeing yourself as someone who has arrived. That premature confidence dulls learning. You stop questioning decisions as critically. You become less defensive against obvious mistakes because you believe you've earned the right to relax. In reality, this phase requires more discipline, not less. What makes this stage particularly deceptive is that the consequences are delayed. The spending doesn't hurt today. It hurts later. When an opportunity appears and you can't act because your money is already allocated. It hurts when volatility arrives and your margin of safety is thinner than you thought. It hurts when you realize that comfort replaced progress, and reversing that trade is psychologically painful. Restraint at this point is not about deprivation, it's about respect. Respect for the effort it took to reach stability. Respect for the future version of yourself who will need options, not excuses. Treating early financial progress as fragile instead of permanent keeps behavior aligned with long-term goals. People who win at this stage understand something most don't. The purpose of early money is not consumption, but control. Control over time, decisions, and direction. Preserving that control requires resisting the urge to signal success before it actually exists. The irony is that those who delay visible rewards often end up with far greater ones, while others are busy displaying progress. The disciplined few are quietly extending the runway, protecting their flexibility, and setting themselves up for outcomes that look sudden from the outside, but were patiently built through restraint and foresight. At this stage, income stops being the most important variable, and behavior takes its place. Many people assume that earning more will automatically fix their financial trajectory, but that assumption collapses once there is enough money to expose habits. Around this level, discipline becomes visible, not in what you say you value, but in what you actually do when no one is watching and no crisis is forcing your hand. With a modest financial cushion, excuses lose credibility. You can no longer blame every poor decision on survival. The environment is stable enough that patterns reveal character. Do you save first or spend first? Do you think in months or in years? Do you follow rules you set for yourself, or do you renegotiate them whenever something tempting appears? These questions answer themselves through behavior, not intention. Delayed gratification becomes the dividing line. Emotional decisions still feel good in the moment, but now you can see their true cost more clearly. Every impulsive choice competes with a future opportunity. Every unnecessary expense trades flexibility for comfort. Discipline isn't about restriction, it's about alignment. It's the ability to keep present actions consistent with long-term objectives, even when doing so feels boring or unrewarding. This is also where rationality proves its value. A person with small capital and sound judgment often outperforms someone with higher income and poor control. Emotional swings overconfidence, and impatience can destroy far more value than low earnings ever could. The disciplined individual avoids obvious mistakes, repeats sensible actions, and lets time do the heavy lifting. Over long periods, that approach quietly dominates. Another critical shift occurs in self-trust. When you consistently act in your own long-term interest, confidence grows naturally. Not the loud, performative kind, but a calm certainty that you can rely on yourself. That trust reduces anxiety and decision fatigue. You no longer need constant motivation because habits carry the load. Discipline also creates clarity. With fewer impulsive decisions, your financial picture becomes simpler and easier to manage. Simplicity reduces errors. Errors avoided compound just as powerfully as gains achieved. Most people underestimate how much progress comes from not sabotaging themselves. Importantly, this stage teaches humility. You realize that progress is rarely dramatic. It comes from repeated, unexciting choices made consistently over time. That understanding immunizes you against flashy promises and unrealistic expectations. You stop chasing shortcuts because you've seen how reliable steady behavior can be. The outcome of this phase isn't immediate wealth, it's stability of character. And once behavior is stable, income growth becomes additive instead of corrective. Money stops fixing mistakes and starts amplifying good judgment, which is exactly how durable success is built. At this level, money stops hiding your weaknesses and starts revealing them. When resources are extremely limited, nearly any mistake can be blamed on circumstance. But once you have a reasonable cushion, that excuse disappears. What remains is behavior. And behavior, not income, determines whether progress continues or quietly reverses. With some financial stability, every decision becomes a test of self-control. Not dramatic tests, but ordinary ones. Do you increase spending simply because you can or because it genuinely improves your long-term position? Do you stick to principles when temptation appears, or do you adjust your standards to justify convenience? These moments seem small, but they accumulate fast. This is where delayed gratification separates serious builders from lifelong strugglers. The disciplined person understands that every dollar has two potential uses: immediate comfort or future leverage. Choosing leverage repeatedly is not exciting, but it is powerful. It creates options. It preserves flexibility. It keeps the future open. The emotional person, on the other hand, trades optionality for instant relief, often without realizing what was lost until it's too late. Rationality becomes the real advantage here. You don't need exceptional intelligence. You need consistency. Avoiding obvious mistakes matters more than making occasional brilliant moves. Overspending, chasing trends, overconfidence, and impatience quietly destroy more wealth than bad luck ever could. The disciplined individual sidesteps these traps not through willpower alone, but through systems, rules, and restraint. This stage also exposes whether someone respects compounding or tries to replace it with urgency. Compounding rewards repetition and patience. Urgency rewards activity, not progress. When you consistently choose patience, small advantages stack. When you chase excitement, gains evaporate. Over time, the difference becomes enormous. Another transformation happens internally. When you repeatedly act in alignment with your long-term interests, self-trust grows. You no longer rely on motivation, inspiration, or external pressure. Habits take over. Decisions become simpler. Stress decreases because outcomes become more predictable. That calm confidence is earned, not imagined. Discipline also creates simplicity. Fewer impulsive decisions mean fewer variables to manage. Simplicity reduces errors. Errors avoided protect capital, energy, and focus. Most people underestimate how powerful this effect is over years. Progress often comes less from what you do and more from what you refuse to do. At this point, income growth becomes secondary. With disciplined behavior in place, additional money no longer repairs damage, it accelerates direction. Money amplifies whatever judgment exists. If judgment is poor, it speeds failure. If judgment is sound, it compounds success. And that is why discipline, not income, decides the outcome long before the numbers get large. At this stage, the most important compounding is no longer happening in your bank account. It's happening in your behavior, your confidence, and your identity. Financial progress begins to reinforce itself internally. Each rational decision strengthens the belief that patience works. And that belief quietly changes how you move through the world. When actions repeatedly align with long-term thinking, confidence stops being something you borrow from motivation or outside validation. It becomes earned. You trust yourself because you've seen proof. You've delayed gratification and survived. You've passed on short-term rewards and watched better outcomes appear later. That evidence is powerful, and once it accumulates, it's difficult to shake. This internal compounding creates a calm that most people mistake for lack of ambition. In reality, it's the opposite. Calm removes the need to prove anything. You no longer chase attention, approval, or trends. You stop copying what others are doing simply because it looks successful. Instead, you evaluate opportunities through logic and probability. When something doesn't make sense, you ignore it without regret. With that calm comes selectivity. You make fewer decisions, but they are better ones. You understand that energy and focus are finite, and wasting them on low-quality opportunities is a hidden cost. Saying no becomes easier, not because you're indifferent, but because you're clear. Clarity is a competitive advantage, especially in a world full of noise. Another shift occurs in how you view setbacks. Because you've built internal stability, mistakes no longer threaten your identity. You correct them without drama. You extract lessons without emotional attachment. This ability to learn without self-destruction accelerates progress more than raw talent ever could. As confidence compounds, independence follows. Advice turns into input, not instruction. You listen widely but decide narrowly. You're no longer swayed by urgency, hype, or fear of missing out. Time becomes an ally instead of a pressure. You're willing to wait, knowing that waiting is often the most intelligent move available. This internal strength changes how others perceive you as well. People sense when someone is not desperate. Negotiations improve. Opportunities come from unexpected places. Not because you're chasing them, because you're positioned to recognize and evaluate them correctly. Eventually, this compounding becomes self-reinforcing. Rational behavior leads to better outcomes, which strengthens confidence, which improves decision-making, which produces even better results. From the outside, it looks like momentum. From the inside, it feels like stability. That is the real transformation most people miss. Wealth begins as numbers, but durability comes from character. Once your internal systems are sound, external results tend to follow naturally, quietly, and with far less effort than most people expect.